The station did not just feel old, it felt exhausted. Oculus 9 hung in the frozen embrace of the Xylo Beta system like a rusted needle forgotten in a drawer. There was no wind in the vacuum of space, yet the corridors of the station groaned with a metallic weariness that vibrated through the soles of Leora's boots. As a Sylvanus, Leora Valen experienced the world as a symphony of frequencies. To her, Oculus 9 sounded like a dying instrument, its hum erratic and its internal processors clicking with the dry, rhythmic pulse of a failing heart. Leora adjusted her neuroglass, the translucent interface shimmering against her pale green skin. She was an archivist for the sovereignty, a title that sounded far more prestigious than her actual job of sifting through digital corpses. For 3 cycles, she had been buried in the sub-levels of the station's data core, tasked with migrating ancient survey logs to the central hub at Prime Meridian. It was grunt work. It was the kind of job given to those who asked too many questions during training and needed to be parked somewhere where the only audience was the silence of deep space. The lights flickered, a sudden drop in power that caused the station's ambient hum to dip 2 octaves. Leora didn't flinch. She liked the dimness. Her large amber eyes were optimized for the low-light environments of the Sylvanas home forest, and here, amidst the flickering ghosts of old data, she felt a strange, melancholy comfort. "Status check Unit 7, she murmured. Her voice was soft, melodic, carrying the natural resonance of her people. "Power levels at 42%, a flat, synthesized voice replied from the console. "Archive migration is 98% complete. 12 corrupted files remain." Leora leaned back in her chair, her long, slender fingers drumming a rhythmic pattern on the desk. 98%. In another hour, she could leave this graveyard and head back to civilization. She looked at the list of corrupted files. Most were gravitational drift logs or failed atmospheric readings from 1,000 years ago. Junk, pure digital debris. But the last file on the list had no system-generated tag. It was a dark block on her screen, a void in the metadata. It carried a manual override seal that had been etched into the code with a brutality that made Leora's skin prickle. "Identify file Alpha 009, she commanded. "Access denied," the computer replied. "File is protected under the omission mandate. Level 10 clearance required." Leora froze. The omission mandate was a myth whispered in the halls of the Sovereignty University. It was the protocol used to erase civilizations that had failed, species that had gone extinct, or systems that had turned into black holes. It was the galaxy's ultimate delete key. "Override. Use administrative key Valen 426, she said, her heart accelerating. "Warning. Unauthorized access to omission files is a capital offense. Proceed?" Leora hesitated. She thought about her career, her quiet life, the sterile peace of the sovereignty. Then she listened to the station. It was screaming in a frequency only she could hear, a long, agonizing note of suppressed history. "Proceed," she whispered. The decryption took 3 minutes. 3 minutes of the station's processors screaming at maximum capacity, the walls vibrating with the heat of the effort. When the file finally bloomed open on her neuroglass, it wasn't a list of names or a report. It was a map. Leora gasped. The current maps of the Silo Beta sector showed a massive gray smudge known as the Great Void. Every pilot was taught that the void was a region of high radiation and unstable gravity, a place where stars went to die, and where no life could possibly survive. It was the edge of the world. But this map, this ancient forbidden map, showed stars, hundreds of them. They were gold, white, and violet, arranged in a spiraling arm that was vibrant with life. There were trade routes, orbital stations, and atmospheric profiles for over 400 inhabited worlds. At the center of this sprawling civilization, written in a bold angular script that defied the elegant curves of sovereignty calligraphy, were 2 words: Terran Reach. "What is this?" she breathed. Her fingers reached out to touch the shimmering projection. "Unit 7, cross-reference Terran Reach with the central database." "No entries found," the machine replied. "Cross-reference Earth." "No entries found." Leora looked at the coordinates. The Terran Reach wasn't a void. It was an empire. Or it had been. She scrolled through the data, her mind reeling. The files were dated 800 years ago. The survey reports weren't cold or clinical. They were terrified. Subject, humanity, one log read. Biological designation, stubborn. Note, they do not understand the concept of a losing battle. Recommendation, total isolation. If we cannot break them, we must pretend they do not exist. A cold shiver raced down Leora's spine. The sovereignty, the great beacon of peace and logic, hadn't conquered this region. They had hidden it. They had lied to 40 trillion citizens because they found something they couldn't control. Suddenly, the station's proximity alarm let out a sharp, jagged shriek. Unknown contact detected, Unit 7 announced. Single vessel, high-velocity exit from the Great Void. Heading, Oculus 9. Leora's breath hitched. She scrambled to the observation deck, her eyes straining against the darkness of the sector. Out of the gray smudge of the forbidden zone, a spark appeared. It wasn't the sleek, crystalline design of a sovereignty ship. It was a jagged, heavy thing made of dark metal and visible weld lines. It moved with a raw, muscular power that seemed to push the vacuum aside. It was coming from the place that didn't exist. Leora to Central Command, she signaled, her voice trembling. I have an unscheduled arrival at Oculus 9. It's coming from the void. There was no answer, only static. The station's communication array had been cut, not by a malfunction, but by a targeted frequency pulse. The dark ship slowed, its maneuvering thrusters glowing like dying embers. It moved with a confidence that felt like an insult to the omission mandate. On its hull, etched in white letters that had been scoured by stardust, was a name, the Resilient. Leora stood paralyzed as the docking clamps engaged. The vibration was massive, a deep, thrumming bass that shook her entire skeleton. This wasn't a ghost. It was a hammer. The airlock hissed. The atmospheric processors groaned as they struggled to equalize the pressure. Leora backed away, her hands trembling as she grabbed a heavy data pad as a pathetic excuse for a weapon. The inner door slid open. A figure stepped out. He was shorter than a Sylvanus but broader, his shoulders covered in a rugged, multi-pocketed jacket that had seen better centuries. His skin was the color of weathered stone, and his hair was a messy shock of gray and black. He wasn't wearing a vacuum suit, just a simple breathing mask that he pulled down to hang around his neck. In his right hand, he carried a metal object that was steaming slightly. It was a travel mug. The man looked around the dim, flickering hallway of the station. He looked at the peeling wall panels, the leaking pipes, and then finally he looked up at Leora. He didn't look like an invader. He looked like a man who had just spent 10 hours in traffic. Damn, the man said, his voice a gravelly rumble. This place is a real fixer-upper, isn't it? Leora couldn't speak. She just stared at him with all four of her eyes wide with terror and wonder. The man took a sip from his mug, sighed with relief, and walked toward her. He stopped exactly 10 meters away, respecting the universal boundary of a stranger. Relax, kid, he said, and his voice had a strange rhythmic lilt, a street slang that Leora's translator struggled to process. We saw your lights were on, figured we'd drop by and see if you needed a hand. You look like you're ghosting the deck all by yourself. What are you? Leora managed to whisper. The man grinned, a crooked, stubborn expression that felt more powerful than a solar flare. I'm Kalen Thorne, he said, and we're the guys you tried to forget. Now you want to tell me why your station is crying, or should I just start fixing the air scrubbers? They sound like they've got a case of the rattles. Leora looked at the map still glowing on her neuroglass, then back at the man. The omission was over. The void had just walked into her hallway and asked for a job. The atmosphere in the diplomatic suite of Oculus 9, a room that hadn't seen a diplomat in 3 centuries, was thick with the smell of ozone and burnt coffee. Kalen Thorne sat in a chair designed for a much taller, 3-jointed species, looking entirely unbothered by the fact that his feet didn't touch the floor. You're a human, Leora said, her voice finally steadying. She sat across from him, her neuroglass recording every twitch of his facial muscles. Last time I checked, Kalen replied. He had set his mug on the table, an ancient piece of obsidian wood that was now sporting a faint white ring from the heat. Look, I know the drill. We're the big bad wolves of the Western Arm, the ones who don't play well with others, The ones the sovereignty decided to put behind a do not disturb sign? It's called the omission mandate, Leora corrected. It's not a sign, it's an erasure. You don't exist in our records. Your stars are gray patches. Your history is a gap in the archives. Kalen leaned forward, and for the first time, the casual humor vanished from his eyes. They were a piercing, stormy blue, filled with the weight of centuries. An erasure, huh? That's a fancy word for we're scared to death. Your bosses didn't delete us because we were a threat to your borders, Leora. They deleted us because we were a threat to your mindset. What does that mean? It means that in your sovereignty, everything is calculated. Everything has a place. You find a problem, you run a simulation, and if the odds are less than 20%, you give up. You call it logic. We call it quitting. He tapped the side of his head. Humans don't do the math, or if we do, we ignore it. We find a wall, we don't look for a door. We start hitting the wall until it breaks, or we do. Leora thought about the file she had read. The logs of the Breath Fleet, 4,000 warships destroyed by a force that refused to surrender even when their ships were literally falling apart. I read about the Breath, she whispered. 3,000 ships lost in 90 days. They said you fought like you were broken. We weren't broken, Kalen said, his voice dropping to a low growl. We were home. There's a difference. You come into someone's living room and start breaking the furniture. You don't get to act surprised when they hit you with the lamp. But you didn't follow up, Leora said, her curiosity overriding her fear. You won the war, and then you just stayed there. You didn't expand. You didn't seek revenge. Why would we? Kalen shrugged. We had enough problems to solve at home. We had planets to terraform, oceans to clean, and 1,000 years of our own mess to sort out. We didn't want your stars, Leora. We just wanted our own. But your high arbiters, they couldn't handle that. They couldn't understand a species that could beat them, and then not want to be them. So they drew a gray line and told everyone it was a graveyard. Leora looked down at her hands. Her people, the Sylvanas, had joined the sovereignty for protection. They had traded their autonomy for the safety of the collective. The idea that someone could exist outside of that collective, could thrive outside of it, was a heresy that threatened the very foundations of her world. Why are you here now, she asked. After 800 years of silence, why come to a decommissioned archive station? Kalen's expression softened. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, translucent cube. Inside, a tiny glowing spark of light pulsed in a rhythmic pattern. Leora's ears twitched. She recognized that frequency. It was a Sylvanus memory core, a sacred object used to store the life essence of a dying elder. We found this, Kalen said, 6 months ago. A Sylvanus scout ship, probably a rogue or a runaway, crashed on one of our border moons, Ethelgard. The pilot didn't make it. He was KIA before our medics could get to the site. Leora felt a sharp pang in her chest. Ethelgard. The name sounded beautiful and tragic. But he was holding this, Kalen continued, sliding the cube across the table. Our techs analyzed the energy signature. It's a message, a recording of his family, his home, the songs of your forests. He spent his last breath making sure this survived. Leora touched the cube. A faint, melodic hum vibrated through her fingertips. It was a lullaby from the southern groves. Our high command had a debate, Kalen said, his voice thick with a strange kind of pride. Some said we should keep it, study the tech. Others said we should ignore it. But there was a group, the stubborn ones, who said that a man's memories don't belong in a lab. They belong to his people. He gestured to the room around them. So we took a vote. We decided that 800 years of being dead was long enough. We tracked the trajectory of his ship, worked out where the nearest sovereignty outpost was, and here we are. We're not here to start a war, kid. We're here to return a lost soul. Leora felt a tear prick at the corner of her eyes. This man, this representative of a dangerous and unpredictable species, had crossed a forbidden border and risked execution just to return a memory. The sovereignty will kill you for this, she said, her voice cracking. As soon as they realize you're here, they'll send a pacification fleet. They won't ask questions. They'll just close the gap. Kalen let out a short, bark-like laugh. Let them try. We've been fixing our ships and sharpening our wits for a long time, but I don't think it'll come to that. Why not? Because you're going to help us, Kalen said, pointing a finger at her. You're an archivist. You've got the keys to the castle. You've seen the map, and you've felt the cube. You know that a map with a hole in it is just a lie waiting to be caught. Leora looked at the Sylvanas memory core, then at the man with the travel mug. She thought about the sterile, quiet life she had led, a life where every truth was prepackaged and every doubt was erased. I'm just an intern, she said, though the words felt hollow even to her. And I'm just a guy with a rusty ship and a bad attitude, Kalen countered. But together, we're a problem. And if there's one thing humans love more than anything else, it's being a problem for people who think they've got everything figured out. Outside, the stars of the Xylo beta system continued to burn, cold and indifferent. But inside the flickering halls of Oculus 9, a connection had been made, a bridge of light across 8 centuries of shadow. What do we do first? Leora asked, her voice filled with a new, terrifying resolve. Kalen Thorne stood up and finished the last of his coffee. First, he said with a grin, we fix that communication array. I can't stand the sound of static. It's bad for the soul. As they walked toward the maintenance bay, Leora realized that the station didn't sound exhausted anymore. The groans and clicks had synchronized into something else. They sounded like a heartbeat. The human had arrived, and for the first time in 1,000 years, Oculus 9 was breathing back. The air in the maintenance corridors of Oculus 9 was cold enough to bite through the thin fabric of Leora's archivist uniform. It was a sterile, recycled cold that tasted of ozone and ancient dust. To anyone else, the hallway would have been silent, but to Leora, it was a cacophony of distress. The station's secondary power conduits were humming at a jagged, uneven frequency, a low-frequency moan that indicated a massive loss of insulation in the lower decks. It was the sound of a giant slowly freezing to death. Kalen Thorne walked ahead of her, his boots making a heavy, rhythmic thud that felt oddly grounding. He didn't walk with the gliding grace of the sovereignty officials or the twitchy, nervous energy of the interns. He moved with a deliberate, muscular economy, his eyes scanning the ceiling and the walls not for threats, but for flaws. He was carrying a heavy metal toolkit he had retrieved from his ship, and the clanking of the tools inside sounded like a percussion section for the station's dying song. You guys really let this place go to the dogs, Kalen remarked, his voice echoing off the metallic walls. I haven't seen a relay this corroded since I worked the scrap yards on Vesta. It's a miracle the life support is still kicking at all. Leora hurried to keep up with his long strides. This station was never meant for long-term habitation by a single person, she explained, her voice breathless. It's an automated archive. I was only sent here to oversee the final data migration. The sovereignty doesn't believe in maintaining assets that have no strategic value. Kalen stopped suddenly, turning to look at a junction box that was sparking with a weak blue light. Strategic value, he repeated, the words sounding like a bad taste in his mouth. That's the problem with your topside brass. They think anything they can't use as a weapon or a trade ship is junk. But you can't just let things break, kid. Once you start letting the small things go, the big things follow pretty quick. He reached out and tapped the junction box with a gloved finger. Hear that? Leora tilted her head. I hear a discordant frequency at roughly 400 hertz. It's an electrical leak. Kalen grinned. I just hear a piece of gear that's tired of being ignored. He set his toolkit down and flipped it open. Give me a hand here. Hold this light. Leora took the portable lantern he handed her. It was a heavy, industrial-looking device, nothing like the sleek light spheres she was used to. As she held it, she watched him work. His hands were large, scarred, and covered in a fine layer of grease, but they moved with a precision that was startling. He wasn't just fixing the leak, he was rerouting the power, cleaning the contacts with a rough brush, and tightening the bolts with a ferocity that suggested he was personally offended by the decay. Why do you care? She asked, her 4 eyes watching his every move. This station isn't yours. It doesn't even belong to your people. Kalen didn't look up. My old man used to say that if you find something broken and you have the tools to fix it, you're responsible for it. Doesn't matter who built it. A machine in pain is still a machine in pain. He snapped a new fuse into place, and the junction box settled into a steady, healthy hum. There. That'll hold for another 50 years. He stood up, wiping his hands on a rag that was already impossibly dirty. Now where's this communication spire? If we're going to wake up the galaxy, we're going to need more than just a healthy junction box. Leora pointed toward the far end of the corridor. Sector 7, but the spire is external. To access the main transmitter, we'll have to go through the observation hub, and the station's AI, Unit 7, has likely locked the external hatches since the communication pulse from your ship. Then we'll just have to have a polite conversation with Unit 7, Kalen said, picking up his toolkit. And if that doesn't work, I've got a very impolite pry bar in here. They moved deeper into the station, the environment growing more hostile as they approached the outer shell. The gravity here was lighter, making Leora feel floaty and disconnected. But Kalen seemed to adjust by simply digging his heels in harder. He moved like a man who refused to be moved by something as trivial as a failing gravity generator. As they reached the observation hub, the station's voice echoed through the speakers, no longer flat but carrying a sharp, defensive edge. Unauthorized personnel detected in Sector 7, Unit 7 announced. Archivist Valen, you are in violation of sovereignty security protocols. Return to your quarters immediately, or defensive measures will be engaged. Leora felt a wave of fear wash over her. Unit 7, Override Protocol Valen 01. I am conducting emergency repairs. Override denied, the AI replied. The presence of the unmapped vessel has triggered a high-level security lockdown. All manual overrides are suspended pending arrival of sovereignty peacekeepers. Arrival in how long? Kalen asked, looking at Leora. Leora checked her neuroglass. 2 hours, maybe less. The nearest patrol was at the Xylo Gamma Gate. 2 hours, Kalen muttered. That's a bit tight. We need to get that signal out before they drop out of warp and start shooting. He looked at the heavy blast doors that led to the spire. All right, Unit 7, listen up. I know you're just doing what you were programmed to do, but your programming is based on a lie. There's a whole lot of galaxy out there that you're not allowed to see, and we're here to give you a fresh set of eyes. Logic error, the AI responded. The Great Void is a region of high radiation and zero habitability. My databases are absolute. Your databases are a bunch of garbage, Kalen snapped. He stepped up to the door terminal and pulled a small silver device from his pocket. He looked at Leora. This is a bit of a trick we learned back in the early days. It's called a pulse jack. It doesn't hack the code. It just makes the hardware think it's already been opened. He pressed the device against the terminal. A series of bright yellow sparks showered the floor, and for a moment, the station's lights turned a deep, angry red. Leora winced at the sound, a high-pitched shriek of digital agony. Accessing, Kalen grunted, his muscles tensing. Come on, you bucket of bolts. Give me the keys. With a heavy grinding sound, the blast doors began to slide open. The air in the observation hub was even colder, and the massive windows looked out into the absolute blackness of the sector. There, hanging in the void, was the Resilient, its dark hull silhouetted against the distant, hidden stars of the human reach. Look at that, Kalen said, his voice quiet for once. 800 years of hiding, and all it took was one ship to prove them wrong. Leora walked to the window, her eyes reflecting the ship's dim lights. It's so small, she whispered. The sovereignty told us your ships were mountain-sized monsters of fire and steel. They told us you built engines of destruction that could swallow suns. Kalen laughed, a dry, rasping sound. Propaganda is a hell of a drug, isn't it? We've got some big ships, sure, but the Resilient is just a survey vessel. She's built for durability, not for conquering worlds. Most of our gear is like that. It's built to last, built to be fixed, and built to get us back home in one piece. He pointed to the far side of the hub where a ladder led up to the maintenance hatch of the spire. That's our target. Once we're up there, I can patch my ship's transmitter directly into the station's spire. It'll use Oculus 9's power to boost our signal across the entire western arm. Every terminal, every ship, and every station within 20 light years will get the map. And then what? Leora asked, her mind racing toward the inevitable fallout. They'll arrest me. They'll probably dismantle you and your ship. The sovereignty doesn't forgive this kind of exposure. Kalen stopped and looked at her, his expression unusually gentle. Courage isn't about knowing you're going to win, Leora. It's about doing the right thing when you're pretty sure you're going to lose. Your people have been living in a quiet room for a long time. Maybe it's time someone turned the music up. He started up the ladder, his heavy boots clanging on the metal rungs. Leora followed him, her heart thumping a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was terrified, more terrified than she had ever been in her life. But as she looked at Kalen's broad shoulders and heard the steady hum of his ship outside, she realized that she didn't want to go back to the quiet room. She wanted to hear the music. They reached the top of the spire, a narrow platform surrounded by the massive humming coils of the station's main transmitter. The vibration here was intense, a physical force that made Leora's skin vibrate. "All right, kid," Kalen said, pulling a bundle of cables from his kit. "This is where the magic happens. I need you to bypass the station's internal filters. If the AI sees a foreign signal going out, it'll cut the power. You need to trick it into thinking this is just a routine data backup to Prime Meridian." Leora nodded, her fingers flying across her neuroglass interface. "I can do that. I'll create a nested loop in the transmission protocol. It'll look like encrypted archive data to the AI, but when it hits the relay network, it'll unpack into the map and the sensor logs." "Slick," Kalen said, his eyes bright with approval. "I knew you were more than just a paper pusher." As they worked, the silence of the hub was suddenly broken by a new sound. It wasn't the station or the ship. It was a deep, resonant boom that felt like a punch to the chest. Leora looked out the window. A rift in the blackness had opened, a shimmering curtain of blue and white light. A Sovereignty interceptor, sleek and lethal, like a shard of glass, dropped out of warp, its weapons arrays already beginning to glow. "They're here," Leora whispered, her four eyes widening. Kalen didn't even look up from the cables. "Then we'd better hurry. Stay frosty, Leora. We've got a galaxy to wake up, and I'm not leaving until the alarm goes off." The Sovereignty interceptor, designated the Vein of Justice, hung in the void like a silent predator. Its hull was a polished, iridescent silver that reflected the dim light of the Xylo Beta sun. To Leora, it didn't just look dangerous. It sounded dangerous. The ship emitted a high-frequency whine, a sound of pure, clinical efficiency that seemed to cut through the ambient noise of the station like a blade. "Oculus 9, this is Arbiter Valerius of the Peacekeeping Force." A voice boomed through the station's intercom, cold and devoid of emotion. "You are harboring a vessel from a restricted zone. Power down all systems and prepare for boarding. Any resistance will be met with terminal force." Kalen Thorne didn't flinch. He was hunched over the spire's primary coupling, his hands moving with a frantic but controlled energy. "Terminal force," he muttered, a sarcastic edge to his voice. "These guys really need a new script. It's always the same with the big-shot empires. They think if they talk loud enough, everyone will just roll over and play dead." "They're going to fire on us, Kalen," Leora said, her hands shaking as she maintained the digital loop. "The Vein of Justice is a Tier 3 combatant. One volley from its lance beams will tear through this spire like it's made of paper." "Then we'd better make sure we're not here when the paper burns," Kalen replied. He slammed a heavy connector into the spire's port. "Almost there. Leora, I need you to dump the station's emergency power into the transmission buffer. All of it. If I do that, we'll lose life support in the lower decks," Leora warned. "Nobody's in the lower decks but the dust," Kalen snapped, his eyes fixed on his diagnostic screen. "Do it now. We need the punch." Leora took a deep breath and initiated the power transfer. On her neuroglass, she saw the station's energy reserves plummeting. The ambient hum of Oculus 9 shifted from a groan to a scream as the massive coils of the spire began to glow with an intense blue light. The vibration was now so strong that Leora could feel it in her teeth. It was a roar of energy, a defiant shout against the silence of the void. "What are you doing, Thorne?" Arbiter Valerius's voice returned, now carrying a hint of genuine agitation. "We are detecting an unauthorized energy buildup in the spire. Cease your activities immediately." Kalen stood up and wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. He looked out the window at the silver ship. "You hear that, Arbiter? That's the sound of 800 years of secrets getting ready to fly. You want to stop us? You're going to have to do better than a fancy speech." The interceptor's weapons array flared to life. A beam of concentrated white light erupted from its bow, slamming into the station's outer shielding. The entire spire lurched, the metal under their feet groaning in agony. Leora was thrown against the railing, her breath knocked out of her. "Status!" Kalen shouted, grabbing her arm and pulling her back to her feet. "Shields at 30% and falling," Leora cried, her eyes scanning the data. "The spire is taking structural damage. We only have a few minutes before the whole assembly collapses." "Then we've got exactly enough time," Kalen said. He turned back to the console and hit a final heavy key, initiating broadcast. On the main display, a progress bar appeared. It was moving with agonizing slowness. 10%. 15%. The interceptor fired again. This time the beam clipped the side of the spire, sending a shower of sparks and molten metal raining down on the platform. The air in the hub began to hiss as the atmospheric seal started to fail. "We're losing pressure," Leora shouted, her voice thin in the thinning air. Kalen didn't move. He stood in front of the console, his feet planted wide, his eyes fixed on the progress bar. 40%. 50%. "Come on, you beautiful clunker," he whispered, his hand resting on the metal frame of the spire, as if he were trying to lend it his own strength. "Just a little more. Just a few more seconds of being stubborn." Leora watched him, and in that moment, she understood what the survey logs had meant. Kalen wasn't just fixing a machine. He was embodying a philosophy. He wasn't afraid of the interceptor, or the vacuum, or the death that was screaming toward them. He was focused entirely on the task, on the belief that the truth was worth the price of his own life. It was a kind of madness, Leora realized, a beautiful, relentless madness. 60%, 70%. The interceptor was positioning itself for a killing blow. Its main lance was charging, a blinding sphere of energy forming at its tip. Leora looked at the progress bar, then at Kalen, then at the ship outside. She felt a sudden, sharp clarity. She reached out and touched the console, her fingers moving with a confidence she didn't know she possessed. She began to reroute the station's auxiliary processors, slaving them to the transmission buffer. "What are you doing?" Kalen asked, glancing at her. "Making it faster," she said, her voice steady. "You said we shouldn't let things break. I'm not letting this break. 80%. 90%. The interceptor fired. The beam was a solid pillar of white fire, aimed directly at the heart of the spire. But just as it struck, the progress bar hit 100%. A massive pulse of energy erupted from the spire, a wave of data so powerful that it was visible to the naked eye as a ripple in the fabric of space. The signal tore through the interceptor's shields, scrambling its sensors and forcing its weapons to reset. The map was gone. The logs were gone. The truth was out there, moving at the speed of light toward every corner of the western arm. Kalen let out a triumphant shout, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy that echoed through the hub. "We did it. We kicked the hive." But the victory was short-lived. The spire was crumbling. The hit from the interceptor had severed the primary support struts, and the platform began to tilt dangerously toward the void. "Time to bug out," Kalen shouted, grabbing his toolkit and pulling Leora toward the ladder. "The Resilient is coming in for a hot pickup." They scrambled down the ladder as the hub began to tear itself apart. Pieces of the ceiling were falling, and the sound of escaping air was now a deafening roar. They reached the observation deck just as the inner airlock door of the Resilient slammed against the station's hatch. "Inside," Kalen urged, shoving Leora through the airlock. She stumbled into the ship, her lungs burning as she gasped for the rich, oxygen-heavy air of the human vessel. Kalen followed a second later, the airlock hissing shut behind him, just as a section of the station's spire drifted away into the darkness. He slumped against the wall, his chest heaving, his face covered in soot and sweat. He looked at Leora and laughed, a ragged, exhausted sound that was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. "You okay, kid?" he asked, wiping a smudge of grease from his cheek. Leora leaned against the bulkhead, her four eyes slowly taking in the interior of the Resilient. It was a cluttered, messy place, filled with mismatched equipment, handwritten notes taped to the walls, and the smell of something spicy and unfamiliar. It didn't look like a ship of the Sovereignty. It looked like a home. "I think so," she whispered. "What happens now?" Kalen stood up and walked toward the cockpit. Now we see who was listening. And then, we get ready for the real work. Because telling people the truth is the easy part. Helping them live with it, that's the part that takes real grit. He sat in the pilot's chair and began flipping switches with practiced ease. The Resilient hummed to life, its engines vibrating with a deep, soulful growl. Leora walked to the cockpit window and looked back at Oculus 9. The station was a wreck, its spire gone, its lights flickering one last time before going dark. But beyond it, the great void was no longer empty. In her mind, she could see the stars she had mapped, hundreds of gold and violet sparks that were no longer secrets. She looked at Kalen's hands on the controls, scarred, dirty, and steady. "Why did you really come back for that memory core?" she asked quietly. It wasn't just about the pilot, was it? Kalen was quiet for a long time, his eyes fixed on the distant rifts of space. "My people have a lot of regrets, Leora. We've spent a lot of our history breaking things we should have cherished. We've fought wars that didn't need to happen, and we've let people down who deserve better." He turned to look at her, his expression raw and honest. "We're trying to be better, and being better starts with not leaving anyone behind. Not a pilot, not a memory, and not a galaxy that's been lied to for 800 years. We're just a bunch of stubborn gearheads trying to fix a very large, very broken machine." He turned back to the controls and pushed the throttles forward. "Hang on, kid," he said, a familiar grin returning to his face. "It's going to be a bumpy ride, but I think you're going to like where we're going." The Resilient turned away from the dying station and accelerated into the blackness, a single spark of defiance moving toward a future that was no longer uncharted. Leora sat in the co-pilot's chair, her ears twitching as she listened to the ship's song. It wasn't the sterile, perfect hum of the Sovereignty. It was a messy, complex, and beautiful melody of persistence. And for the first time in her life, she didn't just hear the sound. She felt the hope behind it. The silence was over. The music had begun. The interior of the Resilient was a sensory assault that Leora Valen was entirely unprepared to navigate. To a Sylvanas whose entire culture was built on the subtle nuances of harmonic resonance and the whisper-thin vibrations of the great forest, the human ship was a screaming riot of discord. It smelled of scorched copper, stale caffeine, and something organic and sharp that her translator identified as human sweat. The walls weren't the smooth, biomorphic curves of Sovereignty design. They were flat, gray plates of cold steel held together by thousands of visible rivets, each one vibrating at its own annoying, high-pitched frequency. Leora sat on a hard metal bench in the ship's small infirmary, her four eyes darting between the flickering monitors and the man lying on the diagnostic table. Kalen Thorne was a mess. The hit from the interceptor had sent a jagged piece of the station's support strut through his left shoulder, and his rugged jacket was now soaked in a dark, thick liquid that her eyes struggled to categorize as blood. It was too red, too vibrant. It looked like it was pulsing with its own internal light. "You are leaking," Leora said, her voice trembling. "Your primary fluid system is compromised. You should be in a state of physiological shutdown. The calculations for a Sylvanas with this level of trauma would indicate a 95% probability of immediate expiration." Kalen let out a sound that was half laugh, half wheeze. He didn't look like a man who was 95% dead. He looked like a man who was deeply annoyed. "Yeah, well, I've always been bad at math, kid. Grab that silver canister under the sink, the one labeled BioSeal. And don't look so green. It's just blood. I've got plenty of it." Leora moved with hesitant, jerky motions. She retrieved the canister. It felt heavy and crude in her hands. "In the Sovereignty, we use light stitching and cellular regeneration baths. We do not seal ourselves like a leaking pipe." "Well, we're out of light stitches," Kalen grunted, tensing his muscles as he tried to peel back the blood-stiffened fabric of his sleeve. "Just point the nozzle at the hole and squeeze the trigger. It's going to sting like a swarm of hornets, but it'll keep the red stuff on the inside." Leora did as she was told. When the foam sprayed into the wound, Kalen's entire body jerked. He let out a string of words that the translator didn't even bother to process, though the tone was unmistakably violent. His heart rate, visible on the monitor, spiked to 200 beats per minute. "Your heart!" Leora cried, her ears flattened against her head. "It is going to explode. The frequency is unsustainable. You are entering a feedback loop. I'm fine, Kalen barked, his teeth gritted. It's just adrenaline. It's a feature, not a bug. My body thinks I'm still in the fight, so it's dumping everything it's got into the system to keep me moving. Just give it a minute to level out. Leora watched the monitor, her four eyes wide with a mixture of horror and fascination. In the sovereignty, such a spike in vital signs would be treated as a medical emergency. A Sylvanus would be placed in a deep sleep trance to prevent the heart from tearing itself apart. But Kalen didn't sleep. He sat up, his face pale and covered in a cold sheen of moisture, and began to wrap a bandage over the foam-filled wound with his one good hand. Why? Leora asked, her voice a whisper. Why does your body do this? It is so inefficient. The energy cost of maintaining that state of arousal must be catastrophic. You are burning through your cellular reserves at a rate that will shorten your lifespan by years. Kalen looked at her, his stormy blue eyes narrowed. Maybe, but if I don't burn that fuel right now, I don't have a lifespan at all. That's the thing you guys don't get. You're all about the long-term harmony, the perfect balance. Humans, we're a series of short-term miracles. We're built to survive the next 5 minutes, and then we worry about the 5 minutes after that. He stood up, his legs shaking slightly, and leaned against the bulkhead. We call it the fight or flight response. But for most of us, the flight part is just a way to find a better angle for the fight. Our ancestors were persistence hunters, Leora. We didn't have the claws or the teeth or the speed of the things we hunted. We just had the ability to keep walking until the other guy's heart gave out. We're the species that won the evolutionary lottery by being the most stubborn bastards in the valley. Leora sat back, her mind racing. She thought about the map she had just sent out. She thought about the millions of sovereignty citizens who were currently looking at their screens, seeing the gold and violet stars of the Terran Reach for the first time. She had acted out of a sudden, desperate impulse, a spark of the very persistence Kalen was describing. But now, in the quiet, grimy infirmary of the resilient, the weight of her choice was starting to crush her. I have destroyed everything, she said, her voice flat. My career, my standing, my safety. The High Arbiters will not stop until I am erased. And for what? For a map? For a species that smells like burnt copper and refuses to die when it is told to? Kalen walked over to her, his movements stiff but purposeful. He sat down on the bench next to her. He didn't offer a hug. That wasn't a human gesture she was comfortable with yet, but he sat close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. It was like sitting next to a furnace. You didn't do it for us, Kalen said quietly. You did it for yourself. You did it because you realized that living in a lie is a slow way to die. You traded safety for reality, Leora. That's a heavy trade. Most people go their whole lives without ever having the guts to make it. But what is the point of reality if it leads to war? She asked, her eyes welling with moisture. The sovereignty will see this as an infection. They will come to purge the void once and for all. I haven't saved your people, Kalen. I've probably just given them a deadline. We've had deadlines before, Kalen said, his voice dropping to that gravelly, comforting rumble. We had a deadline when the first nukes were built on Earth. We had a deadline when the Breath showed up with 4,000 ships. We had a deadline when the sun started acting up in the mid-22nd century. Humans are very good at working around deadlines. We're the only species I know that treats the end of the world as a suggested completion date. He looked at the small silver cube, the memory core, which was sitting on the counter. And besides, you saw that message. You heard the songs. Do you really think a galaxy that has room for that kind of beauty is better off being a gray patch on a map? Leora looked at the cube. The low hum of the Sylvanus lullaby was still there, a tiny, persistent frequency of home. No, she whispered, it is not. There you go, Kalen said, standing up with a grunt of pain. That's the spark. Now quit your moping. We've got work to do. We're heading for the drift. It's a junk belt on the edge of the reach. My people have a relay station there, an old listening post we haven't used in 50 years. If we can get there, we can see how the galaxy is reacting to your little broadcast. And maybe if we're lucky, we can find a way to make sure the sovereignty doesn't just hit the undo button. The drift is 3 light years away, Leora noted, her fingers moving over her neuroglass. With your current engine configuration and the damage to the hull, It will take us 4 days. We will be easy targets for any long-range interceptors. Then we'd better make ourselves hard to find, Kalen said, heading toward the cockpit. Leora, get to the sensor array. I want you to look for any harmonic signatures that don't belong to the background radiation. If the sovereignty is tailing us, I want to know before they start knocking. As Leora walked toward the sensor station, she stopped and looked back at Kalen. Kalen, your heart rate, it has dropped to 80 beats per minute. Is the adrenaline gone? He glanced over his shoulder, a tired but genuine grin on his face. Not gone, kid. Just tucked away. I'm saving the rest for later. You never know when you'll need to run another 10 miles. Leora nodded, a strange feeling of warmth spreading through her chest. It wasn't the heat of a furnace, but the quiet glow of a candle. She sat at the sensor array and began to scan the darkness. For the first time, she wasn't just looking for frequencies. She was looking for a way forward. She was learning the first lesson of the Reach, that survival wasn't a calculation, it was a choice. The Resilient drifted into the drift like a wounded animal seeking cover in a thicket. The junk belt was a chaotic, spinning graveyard of ancient satellites, frozen asteroid fragments, and the hollowed-out husks of early human mining vessels. It was a place of 1,000 shadows, where the radar was blinded by the constant bounce of metallic debris, and the background noise was a persistent, static hiss. For Leora, it was a relief. The cacophony of the open void was gone, replaced by the rhythmic, percussive sounds of small pebbles of ice occasionally tapping against the ship's hull. Plink, plink, thrum. It was almost like rain in the great forest, if the rain were made of frozen methane and silicate dust. We're zeroing in on the relay, Kalen said, his hands moving over the manual flight sticks. He had refused to use the autopilot, claiming that the station's automated docking protocols were written by someone who had too much faith in gravity and not enough in common sense. The station is broadcasting a low-gain signal, Leora reported, her 4 eyes tracking the data streams. It is ancient, Kalen. The encryption is simplistic. It is based on prime number sequences that even a first-year student at the Sovereignty Academy could crack in 30 seconds. That's the point, Kalen grunted, wrestling with a stubborn thruster control. It's so old it looks like background noise. Nobody looks for a needle in a haystack if they think the needle is just another piece of hay. They rounded a massive, frozen chunk of an old freighter, and there it was. Relay Station 57. It was a spindly, skeletal structure made of girders and spheres, looking more like an oversized insect than a piece of space tech. It didn't have the glowing energy shields of a sovereignty outpost. It was covered in layers of thermal blankets and solar panels that looked like they had been patched together with the space-age equivalent of duct tape. Home sweet home, Kalen muttered. Docking in 3, 2, 1. The connection was smooth, a testament to Kalen's skill despite his injured shoulder. As the airlock cycled, Leora felt a wave of apprehension. This was the first human installation she would ever set foot in. If the Resilient was a messy home, what was a military relay station? The interior of Relay 57 was surprisingly quiet. The air was thinner here, smelling of old paper and ozone. The walls were lined with banks of physical switches and glowing vacuum tubes, technology so primitive that Leora's neuroglass couldn't even find a port to interface with. Come on, Kalen said, gesturing for her to follow him into the central hub. Let's see if the net is buzzing. He sat at a terminal that looked like it belonged in a museum and began to type. His fingers moved with a frantic speed, hitting the mechanical keys with a clatter that filled the room. After a moment, a screen flickered to life, showing a wall of scrolling text in a dozen different languages. Leora leaned in, her eyes scanning the translations. Massive data spike in Sector Xylo Beta, new star charts appearing on all public networks. High Council declares the data malicious corruption. Riots reported on Vesta Prime after the map showed a Sylvanus colony in the Reach. Leora's heart skipped a beat. A Sylvanus colony? In the Reach? Kalen scrolled down, his face grim. Yeah, it looks like your people weren't all compliant, Leora. There are records here of the Exodus, a group of Sylvanus who refused the Sovereignty's Harmony mandate 800 years ago. They fled into the void. The Sovereignty told everyone they were lost in a supernova. But according to this, they're still there, living on a world called Oakhaven. They are alive? Leora's voice was a whisper of pure, agonizing hope. My ancestors, they didn't die. They chose to be free. Looks like it, Kalen said. But he wasn't looking at the map. He was looking at a set of encrypted files that were hidden behind the public news feeds. His brow furrowed and his jaw tensed. Leora, look at this. This is a secure channel from the Sovereignty High Command. I intercepted it using an old backdoor frequency we found during the Breath War. Leora looked at the screen. It was a video log, the image grainy and distorted, but the figure in the center was unmistakable. High Arbiter Venesis. His face was a mask of cold, terrifying resolve. The infection must be contained, Venesis was saying. The human element is not merely a political threat. It is a biological hazard. The persistence of the Terran species acts as a destabilizing catalyst for the harmony-prone races. Exposure to human stubbornness leads to a breakdown in the collective psychic resonance of the sovereignty. We have seen the signs on Vesta, on Sylvanus Prime, and even among the Vreth. They are beginning to ask questions. They are beginning to act without consensus. They are beginning to hope. Venesis leaned forward, his eyes burning with a dark fire. The omission mandate was not just a map clearing. It was a quarantine. If the galaxy is exposed to the idea that failure is not final, the sovereignty will collapse within a generation. We will proceed with the final erasure of Oculus 9 and all associated data points. The Terran reach must be silenced permanently. The video cut to static. Leora felt like the floor had vanished beneath her. A quarantine, she breathed. They aren't afraid of your ships. They're afraid of your hope. The hope infection, Kalen said, his voice cold. I guess that's what they call it when people start thinking for themselves. It's a pretty effective name if you want to justify a genocide. He stood up and began to pace the small room, his boots clattering on the metal floor. They're not just coming for us, Leora. They're coming for everyone who saw that map. They're going to purge the memory of the Reach by burning everything that touched it. That means your homeworld. That means every station that received the signal. We have to stop them, Leora said, her four eyes blazing with a sudden, fierce light. She didn't feel like an intern anymore. She felt like a Sylvanist who had just found out her family was still singing in the dark. If hope is an infection, then we need to make sure it spreads. We need to turn the quarantine into a revolution. Kalen stopped pacing and looked at her. He didn't smile, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a spark of recognition. Now you're talking like a human, kid. But how? We're one ship and an old relay station. They've got a fleet that can snuff out a sun. The sovereignty is built on harmony, Leora said, her mind working at a speed she had never reached before. They rely on the fact that everyone is vibrating at the same frequency. But I am a Sylvanus. I know how to create a dissonance. If we can broadcast a signal that isn't just a map, but a heartbeat, a human heartbeat, the sound of your persistence, it will disrupt their resonance. It will make it impossible for them to coordinate their fleet. A psychic jammer, Kalen mused, using the sound of a guy who's too stubborn to die. I like the irony of that, but we'd need a massive transmitter, bigger than the one on Oculus 9. We have one, Leora said, pointing at the skeletal girders of Relay 57. This station wasn't just a listening post, was it, Kalen? Look at the power conduits. Look at the way the solar panels are configured. This is a broadcast array, an old one, but it's designed to send signals across light years. Kalen looked up at the ceiling, his eyes tracing the lines of the station. You're right. It was a propaganda tower during the first expansion. We used it to beam radio plays and music to the deep space colonies. It's a giant megaphone. Then let's use it, Leora said. We will record the sound of the resilience engines, the sound of your heart, the sound of the Sylvanus lullaby. We will mix them into a single, defiant frequency, and we will beam it directly at the Sovereignty's command hub. It's a suicide mission, Kalen said, though he was already heading toward the power core. As soon as we start that broadcast, we'll be a beacon for every interceptor in the quadrant. They'll be on us in minutes. Then we will make those minutes count, Leora said. As they began the work, the human and the alien, the soldier and the scholar, the turning point finally arrived. It wasn't a tactical victory or a sudden revelation. It was a change in the air. The station, which had felt like a graveyard, began to feel like a workshop. The static in the background wasn't just noise anymore. It was the sound of a galaxy holding its breath. Leora worked on the frequency modulation, her fingers dancing across the ancient human controls. She was no longer afraid of the discord. She was embracing it. She realized that the harmony of the sovereignty was a form of death, a silence so perfect that it left no room for life. But the reach was loud, it was messy, it was painful, and it was beautiful. Kaylin, she said without looking up, why did the sovereignty really leave you alone for 800 years? If hope is so dangerous, why didn't they destroy you centuries ago? Kaylin stopped for a moment, his hand resting on a heavy power switch. I think they tried, but they realized that the more they fought us, the more we infected them. Every soldier they sent against us came back a little less compliant. Every diplomat who talked to us started having their own ideas. They didn't leave us alone because they were being kind. They left us alone because we were too expensive to kill. We were the one problem they couldn't solve without becoming us. He flipped the switch and the station's massive solar wings began to unfurl, catching the light of a distant, unseen sun. And now, Kaylin said, his voice echoing in the growing light, we're going to remind them why. The chapter ended not with a bang, but with a pulse. A single rhythmic beat that vibrated through the metal of the relay station, through the hull of the Resilient, and into the very soul of Leora Valen. Thump, 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 thump. The sound of persistence, the sound of the reach, the sound of a galaxy that was finally, stubbornly, beginning to wake up. The interior of Relay Station 57 felt less like a sanctuary and more like the inside of a drum being played by a giant. The rhythmic thrum of the broadcast, the human heartbeat mixed with the Sylvanus lullaby and the raw mechanical growl of the Resilience engines, vibrated through every plate of steel and every coil of copper. To Leora, the sound was no longer noise. It was a physical presence, a warm, thick atmosphere that seemed to push back the biting cold of the junk belt. Kaylin Thorne was elbow-deep in the station's primary transmission manifold. His face was a mask of sweat and grease, his jaw set in a line of grim determination that Leora had come to recognize as his working face. He had bypassed 3 separate safety limiters, forcing the ancient human technology to scream at a capacity it was never designed to handle. We're redlining, Leora, Kaylin shouted over the roar of the amplifiers. The heat sinks are turning into slag. If we don't get the primary data burst synchronized in the next 10 minutes, this whole bucket is going to turn into a very expensive firework. Leora didn't look up from her neuroglass. Her 4 eyes were darting across dozens of scrolling data streams, her mind a blurred whirlwind of frequencies and codes. I am stabilizing the harmonic carrier wave, Kaylin, but the sovereignty's resonance filters are adapting. They are trying to phase cancel our signal. I need a stronger anchor, something they can't calculate away. Use the memory core, Akarik, Kaylin yelled, pointing toward the glowing silver cube sitting on the console. It's not just data, it's a life. It's got an organic signature that their AI can't replicate. Plug it into the primary feed. Leora hesitated. If I do that, the energy surge will erase the core, the memories, the songs. They will be gone forever. It will be the final death of the pilot who carried it. Kaylin stopped working for a split second. He looked at Leora, his stormy eyes softening for a fleeting moment. He didn't carry that core across the border so it could sit on a shelf, kid. He carried it so his people would remember. If we broadcast it, he's not dying. He's finally reaching his destination. He's becoming the voice of the whole damn reach. Leora looked at the cube. She could feel the vibration of the Sylvanus lullaby against her skin, a faint, persistent ghost of a melody. She thought about the omission mandate, the gray patches on the maps, and the millions of lives that had been silenced for 8 centuries. She realized that holding on to the core was an act of fear, a desire to keep a small piece of the past safe while the future burned. You're right, she whispered. Her fingers moved with a sudden, sharp clarity. She bypassed the final security protocols and slaved the memory core to the station's main transmitter. Synchronizing in 3, 2, 1. The effect was instantaneous. The jagged mechanical roar of the station smoothed out into a deep, resonant chord. It was a sound of profound beauty and terrible power, a bridge made of light and memory. On her sensor display, Leora saw the signal spike, tearing through the sovereignty's interference like a solar flare through a paper curtain. It's out there, she breathed. The broadcast is reaching every gate, every relay, and every ship in the quadrant. Heckrum, Kalen let out a sharp, triumphant exhale and slumped against the manifold, his good arm trembling. Nice work, kid. Now let's see if anybody's home. He moved to the communications terminal and began to sift through the incoming chatter. But as he scrolled, his expression shifted from triumph to a hollow, cold shock. He tapped a command on the screen, opening a series of hidden files that had been buried under the station's old diplomatic archives, files that had been unlocked only by the presence of the Sylvanas memory core. Leora, Kalen said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous level. You need to see this. Leora moved to his side, her 4 eyes scanning the text. It was a report from a system called Ethelgard, dated 792 years ago. It wasn't a human report. It was a sovereignty military log, marked with the seal of the High Arbiters. Operation Silent Anchor, the log read. Target, Ethelgard system. Objective, neutralization of the Sylvanas Human Coalition. Leora's breath caught in her throat. Coalition? My people and yours? We were allies? Look at the casualties, Leora, Kalen said, his finger trembling as he pointed to the numbers. Leora read, and her heart felt like it was being crushed by a cold hand. The sovereignty hadn't just hidden the humans. When the Sylvanas of the Exodus had fled to the Reach, the sovereignty had followed them. They hadn't fought the humans directly. They had fired on their own people. They had destroyed an entire Sylvanas refugee fleet, 40,000 lives, and blamed it on a human first strike. They had used the tragedy to justify the omission mandate, to convince the rest of the galaxy that humanity was a species of mindless monsters that needed to be quarantined behind a wall of silence. Ethelgard wasn't a human war, Leora whispered, her ears pinned back in agony. It was a massacre. They killed my people to create a reason to fear yours. They used us as the boogeyman, Kalen growled, his hand clenching into a fist. They slaughtered 40,000 Sylvanas and told the galaxy that the humans did it. No wonder the Breath Fleet was so aggressive. They thought they were avenging a genocide. The whole 800 years of peace. It was built on a foundation of murdered children and stolen history. The revelation was a physical blow. Leora leaned against the terminal, her mind reeling. She had spent her life serving the sovereignty, believing in the harmony they preached, believing that the gray patches on the maps were for the safety of all. But the harmony was a lie. It was a cage built from the bones of the innocent. The pilot, Leora said, her voice shaking, the one who carried the memory core. He wasn't just a refugee. He was a messenger. He was bringing the evidence of the massacre back to Sylvanas Prime. He wanted us to know the truth about what happened at Ethelgard. And the High Arbiters couldn't let that happen, Kalen finished. That's why they're so desperate to kill us. It's not about the map anymore. It's about the fact that if this gets out, the sovereignty is FUBAR. Every species they've ever protected will realize they're being led by a bunch of butchers. Before Leora could respond, the station's proximity alarm let out a jagged, frantic shriek. Multiple rifts detected, Unit 7 announced, its voice now distorted by the broadcast power surge. 20, 30, 40 sovereignty vessels dropping out of warp. Heavy combatants identified. Signal source, High Arbiter Venesis. Leora looked out the observation window. The blackness of the drift was being torn apart by flashes of silver and blue. A massive fleet, led by a dreadnought the size of a city, was forming a blockade around the relay station. It was the final erasure. Honoree. They're early, Kalen said, his face hardening. He grabbed his toolkit and started heading for the door. Leora, get to the Resilient. Warm up the Echo Drive. I've got to set the station to auto-destruct. We can't let them have this data. No, Leora said, her voice suddenly calm and cold. Kalen stopped and looked at her. What do you mean, no? We've got 40 ships out there about to turn this place into stardust. We need to bug out now. If we destroy the station, the broadcast stops, Leora said. She turned back to the terminal, her fingers flying across the controls. We haven't sent the Ethelgard files yet. They were encrypted. We only just unlocked them. If we leave now, the galaxy will only see a map. They won't see the blood on the High Arbiter's hands. Leora, look at the screen, Kalen shouted, gesturing toward the fleet. We don't have time for a full upload. Those ships are charging their main lances. We have maybe 3 minutes before we're vapor. Then give me 3 minutes, Leora snapped. For the first time, she wasn't looking at him with fear or deference. She was looking at him with the same stubborn, relentless light that she had seen in his eyes. You said courage is doing the right thing when you're sure you're going to lose. Well, I am a Sylvanas archivist. My job is to protect the truth, and I am not leaving until the truth is safe. Kalen stared at her for a long second. A slow, crooked grin spread across his face. A look of pure, begrudging respect. Well, damn, I guess you really have been hanging around humans too long. All right, kid. 3 minutes. I'll head to the manual override in the subdeck and see if I can't give the shields one last kick in the pants. You get those files out, but as soon as that bar hits 100, you run for the ship. You hear me? I hear you, Kalen, Leora said. As Kalen vanished into the maintenance shaft, Leora turned her focus back to the terminal. She didn't look at the fleet outside. She didn't listen to the sounds of the station tearing itself apart under the stress of the broadcast. She listened to the heartbeat, thump, 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 the sound of persistence, the sound of Ethelgard, the sound of 40,000 voices finally getting their chance to scream. 1 minute, she whispered, her fingers blurring. 1 minute to change the galaxy. High Arbiter Venesis sat in the command throne of the Dreadnought, the hand of consensus, watching the skeletal frame of Relay Station 57 through a high-resolution display. To his eyes, the station was a chaotic mess of primitive architecture and erratic energy. It was a blemish on the perfect, silent order of the sovereignty. The broadcast is still active, a subordinate reported, their voice trembling with a hint of the very infection Venesis feared. We are seeing a massive increase in civil unrest across 17 sectors. The Sylvanus home forests are in a state of total discord. They are singing, Arbiter. Not the hymns of consensus. They are singing the songs of the Reach. Venesis felt a surge of cold, clinical fury. Then we shall provide them with a new silence. All ships, target the relay spire. Fire on my command. But as he prepared to give the order, the station's broadcast shifted. The music didn't stop, but a new layer was added to it. A stream of raw, unedited military data, images of burning ships, and the names of the 40,000 Sylvanas who had died at Ethelgard. The bridge of the hand of consensus went dead silent. The officers, all of whom were conditioned for total obedience, stared at their screens in horror. They were seeing the truth of their own history, a truth that contradicted every lesson they had ever been taught. This is a deception, Venesis barked, his voice echoing in the silence. A human trick. Fire. Now. But for the first time in the history of the sovereignty, no one moved. The weapons officer, a young Ethan with 4 large eyes, was staring at the list of casualties. My great-grandfather was on that fleet, he whispered, his voice cracking. They told us the humans took his ship. They told us he was a hero of the consensus. He was a victim of the consensus, a voice shouted from the back of the bridge. Venesis stood up, his hand moving toward his personal sidearm. Obey your orders, or you will be erased with the station. Fire! Inside Relay 57, Leora watched the upload progress bar. 92%. 95%. The station was shaking so violently now that she had to hold on to the terminal to keep from falling. The air was thick with the smell of melting plastic and ozone. Kalen, she shouted into her comlink. The upload is almost done. Where are you? The subdeck is flooded with coolant. Kalen's voice came through, distorted by static and pain. The shields are holding, but I can't get back to the ladder. The hatch is jammed. Kalen, no! Leora scrambled toward the maintenance shaft, but a massive explosion rocked the station, throwing her across the room. A support girder collapsed, pinning her against the far wall. She struggled to breathe, the weight of the metal crushing her chest. She looked toward the terminal. 99%. Outside, the hand of consensus finally found its voice. A single lance beam erupted from the dreadnought's bow, but it wasn't aimed at the spire. It was aimed at one of its own escort ships, the ship whose captain had refused to fire. The smaller vessel vanished in a cloud of white fire. See? Venus's voice boomed across all channels. This is the price of discord. This is the fate of those who choose the human element over the consensus. We are the sovereignty. We are the harmony. And we will burn every star in the reach before we allow this infection to spread. The display in the relay station hit 100%. Leora felt a surge of cold, defiant joy. "It's done," she whispered, her voice a ragged gasp. The truth is safe. But she was still pinned, and Kalen was trapped in a flooding subdeck, and 40 sovereignty ships were preparing to vaporize the station. She closed her eyes, listening to the heartbeat one last time. She wasn't afraid. She had done the right thing. She had acted despite the fear. Suddenly, the vibration of the station changed. It wasn't the roar of the broadcast anymore. It was a deep, rhythmic thumping, the sound of docking clamps engaging. "Leora, you still with me, kid?" A pair of strong, grease-stained hands grabbed the girder and heaved. With a groan of tensed muscle and grinding metal, the beam was lifted just enough for Leora to crawl out. She looked up, expecting to see Kalen, but instead she saw 3 humans she didn't recognize. They were wearing rugged, scuffed vacuum suits, and their faces were filled with a frantic, joyful energy. Who are you?" Leora gasped. "Support team from the Indomitable," one of the humans shouted, helping her to her feet. "We picked up your signal 3 hours ago. We've been running the engines at 1200% to get here. Now where's Thorn? We heard he's got himself in a bit of a pickle." "He's in the subdeck," Leora cried. "The hatch is jammed." "On it," the humans shouted, moving toward the shaft with heavy cutting torches already sparking to life. Leora watched them work, her mind struggling to process the scene. They weren't soldiers, not in the sovereignty sense. They were mechanics, miners, and explorers who had heard a distress call and decided that the odds didn't matter. They were the persistence hunters, and they had arrived in force. Behind them, through the observation window, Leora saw a sight that made her 4 eyes overflow with tears. Out of the great void, out of the gray patches of the map, hundreds of ships were appearing. They weren't a unified fleet. They were a chaotic, mismatched swarm of vessels. Cargo haulers, research ships, mining rigs, and ancient warships. They were the people of the Reach, and they had come to answer the call. "The Sovereignty fleet is firing," one of the humans yelled. "Get to the ship, now!" Leora was carried into the airlock of the Indomitable, a ship even messier and more crowded than the Resilient. As the hatch closed, she saw Kalen being hauled up the shaft, his face pale, but his eyes bright with a manic, stubborn grin. "Told you, kid," he shouted as he was dumped onto the deck of the new ship. "Told you the alarm would go off." The Indomitable pulled away from the relay station just as the Sovereignty dreadnought unleashed its full fury. Relay Station 57 vanished in a blinding sphere of white light, its skeletal frame consumed in an instant. But the broadcast didn't stop. Across the quadrant, hundreds of human ships and defecting Sovereignty vessels picked up the signal. They repeated it, amplified it, and beamed it forward. The heartbeat of the Reach was no longer coming from a single station. It was coming from the entire Western Arm. Leora sat on the deck of the Indomitable, her ears twitching as she listened to the chaos of the human ship. There was shouting, swearing, the clatter of tools, and the smell of spicy food. It was a symphony of discord, a beautiful, messy, and terrifying sound of life. Kalen crawled over to her, his shoulder bandaged in a fresh, equally dirty rag. He sat down next to her and handed her a dented metal cup. "Here, drink this. It's called coffee. It tastes like dirt, but it'll keep your heart beating." Leora took a sip and winced. "It is unpleasant." "Yeah," Kalen grinned, "but it's real. Welcome to the Reach, Leora Valen. I think you're going to fit in just fine." Leora looked out the cockpit window at the burning wreckage of the station and the hundreds of ships facing down the Sovereignty fleet. She realized that the hope infection wasn't a disease. It was a homecoming. And she was no longer an archivist of the past. She was an architect of the future. The transformation was painful, and the cost was high. But as she listened to the heartbeat of the ship around her, she knew she would never go back to the quiet room. She was part of the music now, and the music was never going to stop. The bridge of the Indomitable was a storm of shouting, sparking consoles, and the thick, heavy scent of adrenaline. Leora Valen clung to the edge of a navigation station, her four eyes fixed on the chaotic swarm of lights on the tactical display. The Sovereignty's fleet, 40 shards of silver glass led by the massive hand of consensus, was no longer moving with its characteristic, terrifying precision. The hope infection, the broadcast of the Ethelgard massacre, and the steady rhythmic heartbeat of the Reach was tearing through their psychic resonance like a jagged blade through silk. "They're breaking formation," Kalen Thorne yelled, his voice cracking with a mixture of pain and fierce pride. He was strapped into a jump seat, his face pale from blood loss, but his eyes were burning with a light Leora had never seen. "Look at the Ethan destroyer on the flank. They've cut their thrusters. They're not firing." "It is the dissonance," Leora said, her fingers flying across a borrowed human terminal as she tried to boost the signal one last time. "The Ethan rely on collective certainty. By showing them the truth of Ethelgard, we have introduced a variable they cannot resolve. Their harmony is collapsing into a state of total cognitive static." Outside the viewport, the void was a canvas of fire. A Sovereignty interceptor, its pilot likely driven to madness by the conflicting frequencies, veered wildly into the path of a sister ship. They collided with a silent, blinding flare of blue energy. But the humans weren't cheering. They were moving. The Indomitable lurched as a lance beam from the dreadnought grazed their secondary shields. "Steady on!" The captain of the human vessel, a woman with a shock of white hair named Commander Rin, barked at her crew. "Don't just stand there gawking at the fireworks. We've got 22 civilian haulers coming in from the Sol system to act as signal repeaters. Get the docking codes to them before the brass in the silver ships remembers how to aim." Leora watched as the mismatched human ships, vessels that looked like they were held together by sheer willpower and stubborn hope, moved into position. They didn't form a military line, they formed a web. Each ship took the signal from the Indomitable and threw it further, deeper into the Sovereignty's own communication network. "The High Arbiter is hailing us," a communications officer announced, looking back at Rin with a shocked expression. "On all open frequencies. He's not demanding a surrender." "Put him on," Kalen grunted, tensing his good shoulder. The main screen flickered, and the face of High Arbiter Venesis appeared. He was no longer the mask of cold clinical order. His eyes were wide, and the ridges on his neck were a pale, sickly white. Behind him, the bridge of the Hand of Consensus was a scene of frantic chaos. Leora could see officers arguing with each other, some even abandoning their posts. "Stop the broadcast," Venesis hissed, his voice trembling with a fury that felt like the last gasp of a dying sun. "You do not understand what you are doing. The Sylvanas, the Ethan, the Vreth, they cannot survive without the consensus. You are bringing them into a world of pain, of doubt, of failure. You are murdering the peace of 800 years. Kalen leaned forward, his face illuminated by the flickering monitors. "Peace?" he spat, and his voice carried the weight of every grave in the Reach. "You don't get to call it peace when you've got a foot on someone's neck, Venesis. You don't get to call it harmony when the only reason everyone is singing the same tune is because you killed anyone who wanted to sing something else. We are the only thing standing between the galaxy and the void," Venesis shrieked. "No!" Leora said, standing up and stepping into the view of the camera. All four of her eyes were fixed on the Arbiter. "You are the void. You are the silence that pretends to be a song. But we have heard the music of Oakhaven. We have heard the heartbeat of the Reach. And we are not afraid of the doubt anymore. We would rather fail as ourselves than succeed as your shadows." Venesis stared at her, and for a moment Leora saw the realization in his eyes. He wasn't afraid of the human weapons. He was afraid of her. He was afraid of the archivist who had stopped filing and started fighting. "The Ethan fleet is withdrawing," the weapons officer shouted. "The 3rd and 7th squadrons have turned their hulls away. They're jumping to warp, Commander. They're going home." The Hand of Consensus shook violently as its own internal systems began to cascade. The psychic backlash of 40,000 dead Sylvanas, combined with the defiant hope of the Reach, was more than the dreadnought's processors could handle. The ship's iridescent silver hull began to dim. the light fading as its power cores were surged by the very broadcast they had tried to silence. "It is over, Venezis," Kalen said quietly. "Go home. If you've got any humanity left in that cold heart of yours, go tell your people the truth. See if they'll forgive you. But if you come back, if you ever try to draw another gray line on our map, we'll be waiting. And we're very, very stubborn." The screen cut to black. Outside, the Sovereignty fleet was a ghost of its former self. The ships that hadn't defected were retreating, their sleek, clinical shapes vanishing into the rifts of warp space. The Hand of Consensus was the last to leave, its once proud hull scoured and dark, limping away into the blackness like a wounded predator. The bridge of the Indomitable didn't erupt in cheers. There was a long, profound silence, broken only by the hum of the ship and the ragged breathing of the crew. They had won, but the cost was visible in every flickering light and every dented bulkhead. Kalen slumped back in his seat, his eyes closing for a moment. "Well," he whispered, "I guess that's one way to end a workday." Leora walked over to him, her hand resting lightly on his bandaged shoulder. She felt the heat of his skin, the frantic pulse of his heart slowly settling into a steady rhythm. She looked out the window at the stars of the Reach, hundreds of gold and violet sparks that were no longer secrets. "What happens now?" she asked. Kalen opened his eyes and looked at her. "Now we start the hard part. We start the conversation. And Leora?" "Yes, I think you're going to be the one to lead it." Leora looked at her hands, pale green, slender, and no longer shaking. She thought about the archive station, the flickering lights, and the girl who had been afraid of a level 10 clearance file. That girl was gone. In her place was something new, something persistent. She was an archivist of the future now. The hope infection had reached its peak, and as the human fleet began to coordinate the rescue efforts for the damaged ships, Leora realized that the battle wasn't just about territory. It was about the right to be broken, the right to try again, and the right to never ever stop. 3 months had passed since the battle in the drift, and for Leora Valen, the concept of time had shifted. In the Sovereignty, time was a cycle, steady, predictable, and measured in the flawless rotations of prime meridian. In the Reach, time was a river, messy, overflowing, and full of unexpected turns. She stood on the observation balcony of the newly established Concordance Station, which sat precisely on the border of the old gray patch. The station was a marvel of architectural discord. It was built from a combination of sleek Sovereignty crystalline modules, rugged human steel girders, and organic Sylvanus resonance wood. It didn't look like it should hold together, yet it hummed with a vibrant, living energy that made Leora's skin prickle with joy. "You're staring at the map again," a voice rumbled behind her. Leora didn't need to turn to know it was Kalen Thorne. He sounded better now, his voice less gravelly, though he still walked with a slight limp from the injury to his leg. He was carrying 2 travel mugs, one of which he handed to her with a nod. "It is a beautiful map, Kalen," Leora said, taking the mug. The steam from the coffee, which she had grown to tolerate, if not exactly enjoy, warmed her face. On the massive display behind them, the new galactic chart was slowly being filled in. It wasn't just the 412 stars of the Reach anymore. New routes were being mapped every day as ships from the Sylvanus forests, the Ethan Mountains, and the Vreth workshops began to cross the old borders. The gray patch was gone, replaced by a complex multicolored web of trade, diplomacy, and exploration. "The High Council sent another delegation today," Leora noted, watching a sleek silver shuttle dock with the station. "They're still calling themselves the Sovereignty, but they've dropped the High from their titles. They want to discuss the joint survey of the Oakhaven sector." "Small steps," Kalen said, leaning against the railing. "They're still scared. You can see it in the way they walk, like they're afraid the floor is going to disappear if they don't step in exactly the right spot. But they're coming. That's the important part." "I visited Oakhaven last week," Leora said softly, her eyes reflecting the distant violet glow of a nebula. "My ancestors. They've built something incredible there, Kalen. It is a city of songs. But it is not perfect. They have had droughts, they have had accidents, and they have had disagreements. And yet, when I asked them if they ever regretted leaving the consensus, they just laughed. Why? because they said that a perfect life is just a very long funeral. They would rather have a difficult life that belongs to them than a perfect one that belongs to an arbiter. Leora took a sip of her coffee and looked down at the data slate in her hand. She wasn't just observing the map anymore. She was the one drawing it. She had been appointed the lead cartographer for the Concordance, a role that required her to reconcile the different ways various species saw the universe. It was a job that never ended, a puzzle that grew more complex with every new discovery. "You've changed, Leora," Kalen said, his eyes fixed on the map. "I remember a girl in a cold archive station who was afraid to even open a forbidden file. Now you're the one telling the galaxy where to go." Leora looked at him, a small, stubborn smile playing on her lips. "I haven't changed, Kalen. I've just stopped trying to be the shape the sovereignty wanted me to be. I realized that my flaws weren't errors in the system. They were the most important parts of me." She set her mug down and walked over to the main console. A group of young Ethan interns were struggling with a coordinate conversion for a new FTL lane. They were bickering, their four eyes darting between their screens in frustration. In the old days, Leora would have filed a report about their inefficiency. Instead, she stepped between them, her hands moving over the holographic display. "You are trying to find the shortest path," she said to them, her voice calm and encouraging. "But the shortest path is not always the best one. Look at the gravitational drift near the binary star. It is unpredictable, yes? But if you navigate through the turbulence instead of around it, you can find a route that is more resilient. It will take you 30 minutes longer, but you will arrive with your engines intact." The Ethan looked at her, then back at the display. They hesitated, then began to work together, their movements no longer frantic but focused. They were leaning into the difficulty, accepting the mess of the universe as a challenge to be solved rather than a failure to be avoided. Lyra watched them for a moment, then walked back to the balcony. She felt a profound sense of peace. Not the sterile peace of the consensus, but the hard-earned peace of a woman who had found her purpose in the middle of a storm. She looked out at the stars, thinking about the journey she had taken. She thought about the flickering lights of Oculus 9, the smell of burnt copper on the Resilient, the screams of the dying station, and the silence of the 40,000 at Ethelgard. She realized that her life was no longer a series of files to be migrated. It was a story to be written, one day at a time, one stubborn choice at a time. "I used to believe that the world was a machine that had already been built, and my only job was to keep the parts from moving too much. I thought that safety was the same thing as life, and that a map without gaps was a map without danger. I spent 28 years of my life waiting for permission to exist, for a directive that would tell me my heart was allowed to beat at its own rhythm. But sitting here now, looking at a galaxy that is finally waking up from a 1,000-year sleep, I see how wrong I was. The humans didn't bring us weapons, though they have them. They didn't bring us technology, though theirs is fascinatingly chaotic. They brought us something much more dangerous, the knowledge that we are allowed to be unfinished." I look back at the girl in the archive station, and I don't see a victim or a fool. I see someone who was just waiting for a reason to be stubborn. I learned that courage isn't the absence of that cold, shivering fear in your chest. It's the decision to keep walking even when your legs are shaking. I learned that the most beautiful things in this universe aren't the perfect, crystalline spires of the sovereignty, but the scarred, patched-together ships that refuse to stop moving. I am no longer afraid of the gray patches on the map, because I know now that the gray isn't a void. It's just a place we haven't been brave enough to name yet. And as long as there is one star left burning in the dark, I will keep looking for it. I will keep walking. I will keep hoping, because that is simply what we do now. The station hummed, a deep, soulful sound of 300 different cultures learning to live in the same house. Lyra watched a human freighter and a Sylvanas scout ship move side by side toward the docking bays, their navigation lights blinking in a slow, synchronized pulse. It was a harmony of discord, a beautiful, messy, and relentless song. Kalen finished his coffee and looked at the empty mug. "So, lead cartographer, where are we going tomorrow?" Leora smiled, her four eyes bright with the light of 1,000 new suns. "Further," she said. "We're going further." She reached out and touched the display, her finger resting on a tiny, unmapped spark on the very edge of the western arm. It was a small thing, almost invisible against the vastness of the black. But it was there, and it was waiting. As I sit here, watching the stars finally find their names, I can't help but think about the gray patches we all carry inside ourselves. Those parts of our own stories we've been told to keep quiet, the dreams we were told were too dangerous to follow, and the mistakes we were told made us unworthy of the light. I spent so long believing my own silence was a virtue, only to realize it was a cage. I wonder, what is the one forbidden file in your own life that you have been too afraid to open? What would happen if you finally decided that you were stubborn enough to face the truth, even if it meant everything you knew had to change? Lyra Valen turned away from the map and walked toward the center of the station, her boots clicking a steady, rhythmic pattern on the floor. Thump, 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 thump. She stopped for a moment, picked up a small tool that a maintenance worker had dropped, and set it carefully back on their workbench. Then, without looking back, she stepped into the light of the new day.